The prairie train station sat quiet beneath a sky the color of old tin, the wind tugging gently at the hem of her worn wedding dress. Dust curled around Eleanor Hayes's boots as if trying to carry her back to the past she'd escaped. 38, unmarried, and now unwanted. Her fiancé's family had sent a telegram that morning. Too old. Marriage canceled. Return fare enclosed. She hadn't cried. Not yet. But the ache behind her eyes felt like a storm building in dry air. Across the platform, a man stepped down from a freight wagon, broad-shouldered, sun-worn, and quiet in a way that said he'd buried more than just words. Caleb Warren came once a month for supplies and nothing more. He wasn't expecting a woman in a wedding dress, sitting alone with dignity clinging to her like perfume faded on old lace. Their eyes met for only a second. But in that second, something unspoken passed between two people. Life had bruised in different ways. The train whistle faded, the wind shifted, and the story began. Caleb Warren didn't usually linger at the Prairie Bend station. He hated crowds, and while crowd might have meant just two other people on a Tuesday morning, it was still more conversation than he cared for. But today, something held him still, or rather, someone. She was seated on the far bench, back straight, gloved hands folded in her lap like a school teacher waiting to be called upon. Her cream-colored wedding dress, modest and sensible, was creased and travel-stained. But it was the ring in her palm that caught his eye. She didn't wear it, just held it, like it no longer belonged on her finger, but she didn't know where else to put it. Caleb's boots thudded on the planks as he passed the supply office, nodding once to the clerk who barely looked up. His monthly provisions would be packed and ready by now. Flour, sugar, horse liniment, the usual. But the woman on the bench wasn't usual. He paused just a few steps past her, sensing eyes on his back. Slowly he turned. She met his gaze with a mixture of exhaustion and defiance, as if daring him to say something pitying. "I'm not lost," she said before he could open his mouth. Her voice was clipped, precise, the kind that came from years of teaching or correcting. "I didn't ask," Caleb replied simply. A moment passed. She gave a slow blink, surprised by his lack of intrusion. Most men feel the need to offer advice when they see a woman sitting alone in a wedding dress. "Seems like you've had your fill of men's advice." That earned him a hint of a smile. Brief, barely there, but it settled something restless in his chest. He nodded once and turned back toward his wagon, but her voice stopped him again. "Do you live around here?" Caleb tipped his hat back just enough to meet her eyes fully. 20 miles west, Warren Ranch. The name seemed to mean something. Her lips parted slightly. "I've heard of it. From the station master. He said you raise cattle. Alone." "Not by choice," Caleb answered quietly. "My wife died 4 winters ago. Influenza silence stretched, but it wasn't awkward, just heavy, honest." "I'm sorry," she said. He shrugged. "Life happens, then keeps happening." A gust of prairie wind tugged at her hair, loosing one of the pins. She reached up automatically, trying to fix it. Caleb stepped forward and handed her something from his pocket, a small, worn hair comb carved from horn. "Better than chasing pins in the dirt," he offered. She took it, brushing her fingers along the smooth curve of it. "Thank you. What's your name?" he asked, voice low. "Eleanor." Eleanor Hayes. Caleb looked at her. Really looked. 38 if he had to guess. Proud shoulders, clear eyes. But the kind of tired that didn't come from walking or waiting. It came from being let down too many times and still showing up. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked. "I was. He's not coming." She said it without bitterness, just truth. "His family decided I was too old. Sent a telegram. Told me to go back." He didn't ask where back was. It didn't matter. Not when he could see the weight of those words dragging her shoulders. "My wagon's headed west," he said after a long moment. "It's a quiet place. No one's there to tell you you're to anything." Eleanor looked at him like he might be joking. But Caleb Warren had the face of a man who didn't joke much, especially not about offers like this. "You'd take me with you?" she asked carefully. "I would." "Why?" He considered the question, then answered with the same steady honesty he always gave his cattle, his land, and the few people he trusted. "Because I see the same kind of quiet in you that I've been living with for years. And I think maybe two people walking alone might do better walking side by side. Eleanor clutched the comb a little tighter. Her wedding ring still rested in her other hand. She didn't speak right away, didn't rush. But then she stood. "I won't be a burden," she said. "Didn't say you would." She looked down at her dress, then met his eyes again. "I'll need to change." He nodded toward the wagon. "You can do that after we leave. We've got a long ride ahead." And just like that, she stepped off the platform, not with desperation, but with something steadier, a quiet kind of courage. Caleb helped her into the wagon, not with ceremony, but with care. As the wheels rolled forward, the wind swept up behind them, scattering dust and old expectations into the prairie air. Behind them, the station faded. Ahead, a second chance waited. The road west from Prairie Bend was little more than packed earth and ruts, stitched together by barbed wire and the occasional lone windmill. Eleanor sat beside Caleb on the wagon bench, her borrowed shawl tugged close against the spring chill. Her wedding dress, now hidden beneath a plain work coat, still itched at the collar, a reminder of what had almost been. Neither of them spoke much, not because there wasn't anything to say, but because some things needed silence to settle. Caleb kept his gaze ahead, one hand on the reins, the other resting loosely on his thigh. Every so often he glanced toward her, making sure she was holding steady as the wagon jostled over potholes and dry creek beds. "Your horse's gait is even," Eleanor said at one point. "Well trained," Caleb nodded. "Raised him myself. Name's Jasper. Been with me near 10 years. She paused, then asked, "Do you name all your animals?" "Just the ones I trust." That made her smile, a soft thing hidden in the corner of her mouth. "And the cows?" "They don't need names. They know who they are." Eleanor looked out at the plains, where cattle dotted the horizon like brushstrokes. Her thoughts wandered to her father's small farm in Ohio, where she'd learned to plow straight and make do. She hadn't thought about that place in years, but something about this stretch of land, open and unforgiving, reminded her of where she'd come from, and how far she'd gone just to end up nowhere. "How long has it been since you lost your wife?" she asked gently. 4 years. Was she young? 36. Fever took her in less than a week. One day she was baking bread, the next she couldn't stand without help. "I'm sorry. She was the only soft thing in my life. After she passed, the ranch turned quieter than it ought to be." Eleanor understood, not just the grief but the stillness that follows it. She'd felt it after her mother died, after her sister married and moved away, after each letter from James Cooper arrived with less affection and more obligation. It wasn't always sorrow that hollowed a person, it was the spaces left behind. They reached a ridge just before sunset. The horizon flared in shades of peach and blood orange, casting long shadows across the prairie grass. Caleb slowed the horses, letting them rest. "There it is," he said, nodding toward a dark cluster of buildings nestled against a line of cottonwoods. Eleanor leaned forward. She saw a barn with a sagging roof, a bunkhouse with smoke curling from its chimney, and a main house that stood like an old soldier, weathered but proud. It wasn't much, but it was something real. "You said you live alone?" she asked. Caleb gave a small grunt. "Tom and Burke help out when needed. Young men both. Stay in the bunkhouse. But the house, it's mine. Was Catherine's too. Everything she touched is still there." "You kept it the same." "Mostly. Couldn't bring myself to move her books, or the quilt she stitched the winter before she got sick." The wagon rolled into the yard as dusk settled. 2 ranch hands stepped out from the bunkhouse, pausing mid-conversation. Their gazes flicked to Eleanor, then to Caleb, questions clearly forming behind their eyes. But they said nothing. Caleb set the brake and offered his hand. Eleanor took it, stepping down carefully, her boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt. "This is Eleanor Hayes," he told them, voice firm but calm. "She'll be staying in the house." The 2 men nodded with muted curiosity, then returned to their duties. It wasn't approval or disapproval, just understanding that something had changed. Inside, the ranch house smelled of dry wood, old leather, and a faint trace of rosemary. Catherine, Eleanor thought. It must have been her scent. She looked around. Simple furnishings, worn but clean. The kitchen table bore scratches from years of meals and conversation. Caleb removed his hat. You can take the guest room upstairs. It's small, but the bed's good. Catherine's brother used it during calving season. Eleanor nodded. Thank you. She followed him to the stairs, noting the creak in the third step, the way his shoulders stiffened as he passed a framed photo on the wall. A younger woman in a gingham dress, smiling beneath a cottonwood tree. That night, Eleanor stood at the window in her borrowed room, watching moonlight pour across the fields. She felt the ache in her back from the ride, the unease of not knowing what tomorrow held. But there was something else too, an ember of calm. She turned to the nightstand and saw a small glass of water and a folded linen handkerchief, freshly laundered. Caleb must have left it without saying a word. She sat on the edge of the bed, slowly removed the ring from her pocket, and placed it in the drawer. Then for the first time in weeks, she slept. The rooster crowed before dawn, its scratchy call slicing through the stillness of Eleanor's new world. She sat up slowly, the morning chill licking at her cheeks. Through the window, the sky was a bruised purple, just beginning to lighten. For a moment, she thought about staying in bed, pretending this was all a strange dream. But the ache in her hips from yesterday's wagon ride and the scent of fresh coffee drifting up the stairs reminded her this life was real now. She dressed quickly, pinning her hair into a low bun and smoothing the sleeves of her work dress. Downstairs, she found Caleb already at the stove, flipping biscuits onto a battered tin plate. The kitchen smelled like smoke and bacon grease, and Eleanor realized how long it had been since someone else had cooked near her. He glanced over his shoulder. Didn't hear you come down. You make a habit of rising before the sun? Cows don't much care what time a person prefers. She smiled faintly and stepped toward the counter. What can I do to help? He hesitated, then pointed toward a drawer. Utensils are in there. If you want to set the table, I'll have the eggs done in a minute. As they worked, their movements overlapped in a quiet, unchoreographed rhythm. Him reaching for the coffee pot as she passed by with a stack of plates, her brushing a stray thread from her sleeve as he bent to retrieve firewood. It was awkward at first, but not unpleasant, like learning a new tune on an old piano. By the time the ranch hands arrived at the back door, mud on their boots and sleep still heavy in their eyes, the table was laid. The biscuits were steaming, and Eleanor had poured coffee into 4 mismatched mugs. Tom offered her a shy smile as he removed his hat. Ma'am. Eleanor inclined her head. Just Eleanor, please. Burke elbowed Tom and grinned. She already sets a better table than you ever did, Tom. That earned a soft chuckle from Caleb, who hadn't smiled once the entire previous day. As the men ate, Eleanor listened. They spoke of fences needing mending, of a mare expecting her foal, of a neighbor's windmill that had snapped clean in half during last week's windstorm. She watched how Caleb listened more than he spoke, offering a few clipped phrases when needed, nodding when not. When breakfast was finished and the men dispersed into the crisp morning air, Eleanor began to gather dishes. Caleb stopped her with a hand on the table. Don't feel obliged to do everything right away. I'm not, she replied gently. I just need something to do with my hands. His gaze met hers, steady, unreadable. There's flour in the pantry. Catherine used to make a good cornbread. That recipe box in the hutch still has her notes. I'll find it, she said and meant it. The recipe box was tucked behind a row of cookbooks, its wood faded and smooth from years of use. Eleanor lifted the lid slowly, feeling like an intruder opening a stranger's diary. Inside, recipe cards were stacked neatly, some crisp, others curling at the edges. Catherine's handwriting was graceful, looping letters inked in blue and smudged in places where butter or molasses had likely splattered. Cornbread with honey glaze, biscuits, double rise, pickled beets, never boiled. Eleanor read each one like a letter from a woman she'd never known, but somehow owed a quiet respect. This house still bore Catherine's shape. Her quilt in the parlor, her apron on the hook, her quiet legacy stitched into every room. Eleanor didn't resent it. She simply wondered where her own thread might be woven in. By mid-afternoon, the scent of baking cornbread filled the kitchen. She had swept the floor, reorganized the pantry shelves, and mended 2 dish towels. Caleb passed through occasionally, always with a nod or quiet observation. "Smells good," or "Storm might roll in by nightfall," but mostly he let her be. As the sky turned amber with the approach of evening, Eleanor stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her skirt. The land stretched out in all directions, vast and golden. It didn't care about failed engagements or old regrets. It simply endured. Caleb appeared from the barn, sleeves rolled up, dust in his hair. "I didn't expect you to do all that," he said, motioning toward the house. "I didn't expect to be here," she replied. "But sometimes a body has to make sense of things the only way they know how." He leaned against the post, his expression softening. "The hands like the cornbread." "I'm glad." They stood like that for a while, the breeze stirring the tall grass. The silence between them no longer felt like a wall. It felt like space, like breath. "I know we married quick," Caleb said finally. "Quicker than's usual, even out here." Eleanor nodded. "I'd have said no if I didn't mean to stay." His jaw tightened, like he'd been holding that question all day. She continued, "I've spent most of my life being useful to others. A teacher, a caregiver, a woman who knew her place. But I think," she looked out at the land, "I think I'd like to find out who I am when I'm not trying to be what someone else needs." Caleb didn't reply right away, but his voice when it came was low and certain. "You'll have the space to find out here. No rush." They watched the sun slip behind the hills, its fading light casting long shadows across the porch. In the quiet, Eleanor felt the tightness in her chest ease just a little more. It wasn't love yet, it wasn't even comfort, but it was a beginning. The next morning brought a biting wind that cut through the shutters and rattled the kitchen window panes. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she pressed dough into the cast iron skillet, the scent of sourdough starter and salt rising warm around her. Outside, the sky had darkened with bruised gray clouds. Storms, she was learning, didn't always give much warning out here. Caleb pushed open the back door just before dawn, shaking snow from his coat and boots. "Barometer dropped hard overnight," he said, brushing a hand through his damp hair. "Something fierce is coming." "I can feel it in my knees," Eleanor said without thinking. Then she caught herself, half expecting him to laugh. But Caleb only nodded, setting his gloves by the stove. Catherine used to say the same. They didn't speak for a while. He sat at the table, rubbing warmth back into his fingers, while she finished preparing breakfast. There was a comfort in the silence now, a rhythm to it, not absence but space, room for both of them to breathe. "After breakfast," Caleb said as he accepted his plate, "I'll need to ride north and check the fencing. You'll be safe here. Storm cellar's prepped if it gets bad." Eleanor looked up. "You shouldn't go alone." "I've done it before." "That doesn't mean you have to keep doing it alone." There it was again, that quiet tension that surfaced anytime she challenged him, even gently. But instead of rebuffing her, Caleb just studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "You ever ride in heavy wind?" "No," she admitted, "but I can manage the house, the animals, whatever else needs doing. I'm not just decoration." "I know you're not," he replied, his voice low. "That's why I offered you my name." That stopped her cold. For a moment she forgot about the wind screaming through the eaves or the chills seeping up from the floorboards. She only saw Caleb, rough around the edges, yes, but steady as the earth beneath them. A man who didn't flatter or fuss, but who saw her clearly, perhaps more clearly than anyone had in years. "I'll manage the home front," she said softly. "You ride safe." By mid-morning, snow had started to fall. Eleanor tied her skirts above her ankles and trudged through the yard, gathering firewood and checking the latches on the chicken coop. The hens squawked indignantly as she tossed them extra feed. Inside the barn, she found the old mare shivering slightly, so she blanketed her and refilled the trough with warm water from the house. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Every task helped root her in this life. She returned to the kitchen windblown and flushed, where the fire had burned low. She crouched to add more kindling when something caught her eye. Catherine's journal left on the edge of the mantel. She hesitated, then picked it up. The leather was worn soft, the pages full of tidy writing and pressed flowers. Most entries were about the ranch, calving notes, crop cycles, sewing patterns. But interspersed were small reflections. April 4th. Caleb didn't say much today, but he fixed the porch step I mentioned in passing. It's always the quiet things with him. And June 17th. I think he's afraid of needing people, but he still brings me wildflowers. Eleanor closed the journal gently. It didn't hurt to read it. Not jealousy, not bitterness, only awe. This was a woman who had built something real here, and whose voice still lived in the beams of the house. And now it was Eleanor's turn to live within that space, not as a replacement, but as something new. Late that afternoon, the storm broke with a suddenness that startled her. Wind slammed against the house, shutters banging like pistol shots. Snow blew sideways across the yard. She moved quickly, lighting lamps, securing doors, and loading kindling into the stove. In the back room, the roof groaned under the weight of the wind, and she whispered a prayer without realizing it. Caleb wasn't back. By nightfall, she had convinced herself he was delayed at the north fence line, maybe bunkered in the cabin they kept for emergencies. Still, her chest ached with worry. The storm howled well past midnight. Then, just after 3 in the morning, she heard it. Hooves on snow, slow and heavy. Eleanor bolted upright from the settee, throwing on her boots and coat. She opened the door to find Caleb slumped over his saddle, face pale and soaked through. His coat was torn at the shoulder, blood seeping down his arm. "Help me get down," he muttered, his voice barely above a rasp. She wrapped an arm around his waist, guiding him into the house, struggling with his weight but refusing to falter. Inside, she eased him into the chair closest to the stove, unfastening his buttons with trembling hands. "What happened?" "Tree came down on the ridge," he managed. "Horse spooked. Took a bad fall. You should have stayed in the cabin." "I did, for a while. Then I thought—" He winced as she peeled back his sleeve. "Didn't want you worrying?" Tears pricked her eyes. "Too late for that." She worked quickly, heating water, finding clean cloths. She cleaned the wound, stitched it as best she could, her hand surprisingly steady. His eyes never left hers. "You could have died out there," she whispered. "I didn't," he said simply. "I came back." And somehow, those 3 words felt heavier than any vow. The ranch had settled into a quiet rhythm again. The frost had lifted from the fields and wildflowers began dotting the hillsides, fragile but determined. Ruth stood on the porch that morning with a cup of chicory coffee in hand, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Inside, the house had begun to take on her mark. Freshly sewn curtains, a mended chair leg, a row of jars filled with preserves she and Micah had made together. Micah had grown used to her presence in a way that unnerved him. He knew how easily comfort could mimic something deeper. He watched her brush flour off her apron as she baked, saw her shoulders rise when she laughed at the ranch hand's teasing. It was not love, not yet, but it was something honest, and it scared him. That fear took root the moment he saw the letter in her hand. It arrived mid-morning, delivered by the same dusty rider who brought news and paper once a week. Ruth's hands trembled before she even opened it, as if her body already knew what her mind refused to name. She read it twice, then once more, lips moving silently. Her breath caught, and she folded the letter carefully before slipping it into her apron. Micah noticed. "Bad news." Ruth shook her head, then hesitated. "My sister. She's written. Says I should come home. That I've had my little adventure. That there's still time to save face." Micah's brow furrowed. "Save face with who?" "With the women at church. The cousins who count every wrinkle. The neighbors who already whispered when I left at 38. Ruth's voice was flat. Micah stepped out onto the porch beside her. The wind carried the faint scent of turned soil and horses. "Is that what you want?" She didn't answer right away. "I don't know. I've thought about it. There's safety in going back. Familiarity. But there's something here too. Not just this house. You." Micah looked out over the pasture, jaw tight. "I never asked for you to stay, but I'd notice if you left." That night, Ruth couldn't sleep. She rose from bed and walked outside, the chill sharp against her skin. Stars blinked above like watching eyes. She sat on the swing Micah had hung under the eaves. She remembered his rough hands tying the rope, how he tested it twice before letting it be. She unfolded the letter again. Ruth, it read, whatever it is you're doing out there, I hope it gave you peace. But we need to be realistic. You're not young anymore. The town's talking. You could still find someone respectable. Come home. She folded it slowly, laid it on her lap like a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. She didn't hear Micah until he sat beside her, silent and solid. She makes it sound like you're ruined, he said after a while. I suppose I am, Ruth replied quietly. No. His voice was low. You're remade. Ruth turned to him. What if I stay and regret it? What if you wake up one day and regret me? Micah met her eyes. Ruth, I've lost more than most men ever do. My wife, my boy, even my faith some days. I don't trust easy. But when I look at you, I don't see regret. I see something coming back alive. She blinked, startled by the admission. I'll never be good with word, he added. But if you stay, it'll be because you chose to, not because I asked, and not because you ran out of other options. Ruth looked back up at the stars. I don't want to be a guest here anymore. Then don't be. She turned toward him fully. But if I stay, I need a real place in this life, not just in the kitchen. I want to teach the ranch hands children, turn that old storeroom into a schoolroom, build something of my own. Micah nodded slowly. Then we'll build it. The next morning, Ruth burned the letter in the stove, not in anger, but in finality. The flames curled around the paper, eating the past one line at a time. Later, Micah returned from the barn to find her on a ladder, whitewashing the walls of the storeroom. Her face was streaked with dust and purpose. He brought her a pail of water without a word, and she took it with a smile that didn't ask for permission. It was not a proposal, not a kiss, not a grand declaration, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in years, neither of them felt halfway broken. Winter passed slowly, one brittle sunrise at a time. Snow lined the ridge like an old scar, but beneath it, Ruth could feel the land breathing again, a thaw, gentle but insistent. Life never truly died out here. It only waited. Inside the ranch house, the warmth was no longer just from the fire. It came from the steady rhythm of shared routines. Ruth's teaching room had taken shape. Chalkboards from salvaged wood, benches Micah and Tom built with rough hands and quiet pride. 3 children now came twice a week, including the shy boy from the next ranch over, who hadn't spoken since his mother passed. Ruth had him reciting prairie poems by heart within a month. Micah never said much about it, but he always passed by when lessons were in session, pretending to fetch something from the shed, always lingering by the open window. One crisp morning, Ruth found him standing at the gate, watching the sunrise with that familiar stillness. Looks like spring's coming early, she said, walking up beside him. Micah nodded. I can feel it in the ground. You learned to listen for it out here. They stood shoulder to shoulder in silence for a while, until Micah cleared his throat. Ruth, when you came off that train, you were wearing hope-like armor. I didn't know what to do with it. She smiled softly. And now? Now I know I don't want to lose it. He turned to her fully then, something steady in his eyes. I built this ranch for a family. I thought that dream died with Hannah and Eli. But you brought it back. Not the same, but better. Stronger. Ruth's throat tightened. Micah, I never wanted to be someone's replacement. You're not. You're the reason I can remember her with peace instead of pain. He paused. I still keep her handkerchief in my coat. Not because I'm stuck in the past, but because she'd be glad I found someone with your kind of fire. She swallowed hard. I never thought I'd have a second chance. Well, he said, pulling something from his coat. Then I reckon we're both overdue. He opened his palm to reveal a ring, simple silver, a prairie flower etched on its band. It's not much, but it's real. Ruth's hand trembled slightly as she reached for it. Real is all I've ever wanted. They married that Sunday beneath the cottonwoods at the edge of the pasture. No invitations, just neighbors who came with food, music, and stories. Mrs. Fletcher from the bakery brought a cake, still warm. Tom played fiddle like the wind had gotten into his fingers. The shy boy from Ruth's schoolroom handed her a bouquet of wild bluebells without saying a word. And somehow that felt like the truest blessing of all. As the sun dipped below the ridge, Ruth and Micah stood at the porch of their home. No longer separate lives converging, but one. The months that followed moved quickly. Ruth's schoolroom grew, as did her garden. Micah repaired the barn roof with help from the neighboring ranchers, and he smiled more now. Those rare smiles that made Ruth feel like she'd stumbled into something sacred. One summer morning, Ruth stood over a pot of plum preserves, the scent rising like memory. She turned to find Micah watching her from the doorway, arms crossed, a peculiar glint in his eye. "Well?" she asked. "What are you staring at?" "I was just thinking," he said, stepping inside, "about how sometimes the best things in life sneak in through the back door." She raised a brow. "Meaning?" "Meaning you arrived as a stranger in a dusty dress, and now you've rebuilt half this ranch, taught a dozen kids to read, and turned my life right side up." Ruth smirked. "You're welcome," he chuckled. "And there's more." Micah pulled a letter from his shirt pocket. "Your sister Emily, she's written again. Said your father's thinking of visiting, wants to meet the man who stole his daughter." Ruth took the letter, her heart catching in a strange, sweet way. "I don't belong to anyone," she said, "but I'd be glad to introduce him to the man I chose." Later that evening, they sat together on the porch swing, hand in hand, watching the prairie melt into gold. Micah glanced at her belly, where a barely there curve had begun to show. "I still can't believe it." "Believe it," Ruth whispered. "A new season's starting, and this time, we'll face it together." The wind rustled the cottonwoods, carrying with it the scent of new growth and stories not yet written. Beneath their feet, the earth stirred with promise. They had loved and lost, fallen and risen. And now, with everything they'd built, brick by brick, day by day, Micah and Ruth knew one thing for certain. Some stories don't begin with fireworks. Some begin with a quiet kindness, a handkerchief, a shared silence, and a choice. Some say love fades with time. But maybe, just maybe, the kind that finds you when you've stopped believing, that's the love that lasts. Ruth stood on that train platform thinking her story was over. Micah proved it was only just beginning. Do you believe love like this still happens? Tell us in the comments. Your words might be the next spark someone else needs.